Professor, you've also written about processes and legal concepts in the criminal law. You
Yes.
have an article entitled "Whom Should We Punish and How? Rational Incentives
Right. Right.
in Criminal Justice." Are we doing punishment the right way here in the United States?
Um, well, that's hard. It's a hard question to give a simple answer to, but I think in some ways no. In fact, one of the charts that sorry, I just hit my camera accidentally. One of the charts that I have in that paper, which I find kind of interesting, just shows the increase in the incarceration of women in the U.S. over the past 30 years or so. And it's almost exponential growth if you look at it. And it raises a question, well, have women become so seriously criminalistic over the past 30 years that we're putting, multiples more in prison and in jails than we did 30 years ago? And I think the answer is no. I think we've got laws that ensnare many more of them than we had back then. And the correct purpose to me for imprisoning someone, for incarcerating someone, would be that they are a danger to others, that you don't want to let this person out on the streets because they're going to be harmful to other people. And that's true of basically that's how should I say? I mean, that's probably true of maybe 1% of the women who are locked away. I mean, maybe 1% of them are dangerous to other people, and about 99% you can live, you know, outside of prison, and no problems will result. Uh, and so, in that sense, that's a clear example, in my view, of over incarceration, excessive use of the criminal laws, and it's staring us right in the face. And there are huge social costs that result because these women can't, well, like the men, they can't engage in legitimate work, but unlike the men, they can't take care of their own children, or they can't engage in the activities that you say a mother could engage in if they're locked up in prison. Um, so I think there are huge social costs from having our policies that have led to the incarceration of so many women. Um, the, as far as the criminal laws go, I mean, it's sort of a complicated picture. And, I think the example I just gave is I think, in my view, Exhibit A for the case that we've been incarcerating too many people too quickly. Now, of course, when you get to men, the question is much more difficult, because now you do have a fair number of people who are dangerous to others, and so you have to be a little more careful about this over incarceration question when you get to men. Um, And the one of the topics that I deal with in that paper is just the general expansion of the scope of the criminal laws. And I offer the Sherman Act as one example. Here's an area where we have the criminal law, and I actually confront that ethical question that I raised a few minutes ago, which is, you know, is this an area where criminal punishment should be imposed at all? Is it a criminal matter if the consumer is denied a competitive framework by a bunch of sellers? And I think the case is probably, I mean, I think the answer is no, actually. And so I do argue in that paper that the Sherman Act is an example of overexpansion. It's an old example, but it's because it's an old example, it's a good example of the overexpansion of the criminal laws, that you were injecting them into areas. And so I argue in that paper that there needs to be some scaling back of the scope of criminal laws, and that there should be a general presumption that market activities are not subject to the criminal laws, because market activities naturally involve a willing buyer and a willing seller. So that would say, for example, that prostitution should not be criminalized because it's a willing buyer and a willing seller. In a lot of cases of drugs, I suppose the same argument would go. I mean, certainly in the case of marijuana, the case for criminalization appears to be totally, unpersuasive. And of course, we've moved beyond that. The more difficult question is, what about other drugs? And I admit there might be cases where the external harms are so great that maybe you'd say, okay, we might have to maintain the criminal laws in this context. I think the presumption is that the criminal laws don't apply, and the operative rule would be if the external harm is extremely great, extremely high, the criminal laws might be extended in those areas. And so if you had a drug, maybe fentanyl might be an exception. Maybe because fentanyl is said to be so deadly that you might make an exception for that because there isn't much of a possibility for someone to control its effects. But in the case where you have drugs that people use and they have some ability to decide rationally whether they're going to take them, and the drug doesn't necessarily immediately lead to death or destruction or to something like that, then I think I'd be more inclined to. I mean, what I argue for in the article is limiting the criminal laws to the harmful behavior and the harmful effects that result from those drugs, not from the drugs themselves. So, for example, if there's some particular drug someone takes that leads them to act irresponsibly and hurt others as a result, you would make them criminally punishable for the harm they do to others. And you could even enhance the penalties, in my view. You could even say, we'll give you more time in prison because you harmed others under the influence of the drugs you were taking or under the influence of alcohol. But they would not be punishable just for taking the drugs or just for consuming the alcohol or whatever. And it strikes me that's a more sensible approach to criminal enforcement in this area. Otherwise, what we're doing now, to get back to the example of body parts, we're encouraging black markets, and those black markets that are encouraged bring in people who are criminals. They enforce their agreements with violence, and of course that just contributes to the incidence of harm in society.